Waterfall mindset, originally rooted in agriculture, manufacturing, and construction, has shaped modern management practices, from rigid hierarchies to planning processes. Its influence persists in organizations today, even affecting how we integrate AI. Understanding Waterfall's legacy is key to transitioning to agile cultures and building AI enabled workplaces that truly empower teams. So let's dive into the cascading effects of Waterfall, how they continue to shape our work environments, and how they could shape the workplace of the future. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Agile for AI. I'm Sean. With 20 years of over 20 years of Agile experience, I'm passionate about it. And when I look at the future, I'm both concerned and excited to see what AI brings, the potential of how it can reshape the workplace into something that truly uplifts humanity into areas and levels that may be hard to conceive at this moment. And we need to talk about it. We need to talk about where we come from, where we're heading, so that we can make wise decisions. So I invite you to join me in discussion. I want to hear your ideas, your thoughts, so we can come up with good ideas, good implementations, good solutions that work for us all. So with that, let's jump right in. We're talking about a bit of the historical context for Agile when it comes about and where we're heading. And I wanted to continue on that, and this time looking a little bit deeper into Waterfall itself. Where does it come from? What are its characteristics? What does it create that we see today in the workplace? Is this all new? Is this relatively new? Or is it really ancient? When we take a look back and we examine human history, what we find is that the origins of modern day waterfall are actually thousands of years. This has been an evolution through agriculture, manufacturing, construction. If we take a look, for example, at the Sumerians. Sumerians introduced accounting into agriculture. We have extensive records about not just the crops and what was produced, the output, but also the labor that was being done. Their methods were further refined and elaborated in Egyptian times. And there we start seeing the very detailed planning and a division of labor, strict hierarchies. There was somebody with specialized knowledge that was overseeing other workers, and they in turn reported to scribes who were keeping very detailed records of what was being done, of the work that was being done. So during those times, early times, as I mentioned previously, you can imagine very harsh working conditions. And um, we have agriculture, there were animals. We also have forced labor, and we have devotional labor. These are all factors that come together. There's a taskmaster. The taskmaster persona evolves to put this all together, to keep it all in order, to make it work. And this is where the modern day manager archetype comes from. This is where it starts developing. There's some important characteristics about this persona. This is somebody that is very strong. They had to get animals to do things and under extreme conditions sometimes when the animal doesn't want to move. What do you do? We'll talk about that in a little bit. They needed to be strong. They needed to overpower in order to deliver the task. So the modern persona of a manager, somebody very strong and overpowering that get things done, comes from these early ages. Roman estate overseers did exactly the same thing. So we're continuing. Sumerians, Egyptians, Romans, they were responsible for the day-to-day operations, including the labor allocation and productivity. They use record keeping as well. These are all elements that have been part of our history. And it wasn't just the work, and it wasn't just managing the animals and the people. It was also managing the information, the knowledge. So we have taskmasters and knowledge hoarders or holders. These were people who had all the information. They had the big picture, they had the details, they understood what needed to be done, and it was their responsibility to make sure the workers got it done. So, with this aggregation of information, we may have heard they who hold information hold the future, the keys to the future. By having all of this information, we created classes of work within the workplace. I want to highlight that it didn't have to be that way. This was the model that evolved in humanity, a model that from its very early stages included different classes of labor all in one workplace. So you were working side by side with people who had different focus, different priorities, different privilege, different access, and all came together towards a common goal. We look in the medieval times, there was the guild system. The guild system, we had masters who controlled knowledge, controlled the information, and they passed it down to journeymen and apprentices. Apprenticeship system evolved. And this created a strict hierarchy of skills and knowledge that influences today's modern hierarchical structures. Within these structures, there was a dichotomy of, in the early ages, of voluntary and involuntary labor. So different classes of people within the one workplace. These have always coexisted, and they came in different forms. It wasn't always just about involuntary and voluntary workers. There was also, for example, highly devotional workers that were praised, that were admired within and were cared for. So they had a privileged position relative to their co-workers. If you look in today's modern workplace, there are some privileged within an organization. They have more access. They're favored employees. This creates politics within the organization, and it creates these different status. Status is important. People are concerned when they're in their workplace. They're concerned about the status. Where do they fit into this picture? It's not a flat organization. It's not everybody's equal coming together to work. They're different levels. They're different classes. This all comes from antiquity. We've had this all along. Tracking work, we've had this all along. Division of labor, we've had this all along. All of these elements have been present throughout our history. Modern day waterfall is the modern version of it. It's rooted in all of these historical elements. Another aspect is the tendency to look at things from a one size fits all perspective. Throughout history, there were a lot of good reasons to do that. Humanity figured out that as it specialized in a specific area of work, it improved its productivity. It made things easier to do. We have examples in history where we're taking that to the extreme, but in its positives and led to problems. But in its positives, it has enabled us to increase productivity, our ability to produce and deliver. Taylorism and lean, as I mentioned before, capitalize on this concept of standardizing work to increase efficiency. And that has created brittleness and lack of adaptability in the workplace. The Ford assembly line is a good example. We're talking about the 1913s. The standardized work led to increases in efficiency, no question at all. High productivity, however, this also led to very monotonous type of work, and it has limitations. For example, it was very difficult for Ford to produce different models of vehicles because the assembly line was optimized for the Model T. Doing something else is very difficult to implement. There was limited flexibility and customization. There's the old phrase, any color as long as it's black. Mhm. And this led to a lot of workers' dissatisfaction. There was a lot of monotony in the work, which led to a lot of turnover. And that actually ended up increasing costs for the company because there was a lot of training, retraining that needed to be done. So, this standardization that was brought about by the seeking to improve performance, delivery, productivity had its drawbacks. And we see those drawbacks to this day. Where we come from, embrace some concepts that we see in modern management practices. Bringing us back again into the carrot and stick area. When you have animals and you want to get them to do something, you could offer them the carrot, or if they didn't do things, use the stick to force them to do the work. This translates to a modern era equivalent of the performance review and merit system. In the 19th century, industrial factories introduced this or leveraged this concept of piece rate systems. In the piece rate systems, the workers were paid by the units of work that they produced, and they were penalized. There were fines and wage deductions for any errors or failing to meet quotas. Carrots and sticks. These kinds of systems can lead us down dangerous paths or taken to their extremes. They can create unexpected results. For example, in the 1980s, leveraging this concept of piece rate systems, particularly, I believe that happened with consultants to measure the consultants' work. They were paid by the weight of their development code. So they would print out their programs, the paper would be weighed, and based on that weight would be their salary. Well, as you might imagine, this led to a lot of spaghetti code, a lot of very inefficient code, so they would be very, very, very long, and good caviar lunches because they were being paid a lot to produce very inefficient, bad code. Again, we have to be really careful on the things that we emphasize in the workplace because they can lead to unexpected, undesirable results. Time management, productivity metrics. Again, from Sumerian times, we were tracking the amount of productivity and the labor that was being done. 18th century, Western Indian plantations. It wasn't just about measuring the output of the plantation, the individual output per worker. These are modern day performance metrics. They're rooted in maximizing output from labor from the individuals. We do this to this day. Another trait is the division of labor and specialization. There's an example of a pin factory. This was in the 18th century by Adam Smith, where he describes 18 separate steps to produce pins. So, for example, there was the step of doing the drawing out the wire, and then the step to straighten the wire, and then the step to cut the wire. And what he envisioned was that these would be separate workers who would just be doing each one of those steps. There were 18 of them. Try to imagine the monotony of your job. All that you do is drawing wire, and that's it. That's all that you do over and over and over and over again. Was it effective? Yes. Yes, it was. It, it did increase the output levels. At what cost? Did it create good working environment conditions? These are the types of elements that the mindset that was prevalent in the time. We've been carrying this literally for thousands of years. And is prevalent to this day. It's part of modern day management. In companies today, we have siloing, we have departmental work that segregates different types of work. Is that the best way to do things? It's not the only way. Is it always the best way? Will it lead to positive results? Yes, in some conditions. Does it always lead to positive results? Not necessarily. We'll talk more about that. So, this wonderful mindset and methodology from the software development industry is what we prevalently recognize today as waterfall. That's what we mean when we talk about waterfall. And it's an adaptation of all of these historical elements, whether it's a digital time tracking system, silo development works, or a dedicated QA team, for example. These all mirror elements of historical past, most recently in manufacturing in factories. So, for example, the punch card, specialized labor roles, or having the quality control inspectors. These are all mirroring from our past. We have sequential phases to do the work, which mirror the hierarchical structure of organizations. So, in the waterfall model, we talk about having a requirements phase, design, implementation, and testing. And each of those tends to be done by different groups. And each of those groups, in order to move things from one phase to the next, there's a gate in between that requires approval. And as we keep moving down in the production of the work, those levels increase in their scope and their authority. So the work that we're doing, the work, the way that we've laid it out, the way that we've sequenced it, mirrors the hierarchical structure in the organization. And the unfortunate thing is that that kind of structure that we have today is a result of a huge misunderstanding. In 1970, Winston Royce wrote a paper called Managing the Development of Large Software Systems. He was working in government software, large government development projects, and what he observed was that there was high risk in this single pass sequential model. You have it at one shot to get it right, and this is a huge project. There's high risk of missing the mark, and once you come to the end, if you've missed the mark, there's huge losses involved. He made an excellent presentation that documented the current working practices. He did a great job at it. He put together a beautiful graph that very clearly laid out how things were working. And he was criticizing it. He was pointing out all of its deficiencies. He was pointing out all of the risks associated with it. And his intent was to propose iterative approaches. This whole concept, recent concept now that people say, oh, Scrum does things in a small iterative batches. That's not a new concept. Royce was basing his argument, his criticism, precisely on that approach. Unfortunately, the audience that he delivered this approach to saw it as great documentation and formalizing the way that people were working at the time. And they were unaware of a better way. Royce was proposing that something new was needed. He was proposing that something more sophisticated was needed to match the complexity of the work that was being done. That was his posture. That was what he was trying to, the point that he was trying to drive across. And unfortunately, his presentation was seen as a documentation presentation of the way to do things. It formalized it and people adopted it. That's not his intent. That was not his intent. And it's very unfortunate because that became the model that work since then has been shaped after. And then again, there was no reason. This was a choice. There was no reason to go down that path. We had good examples to show us a different path into more iterative, less risky type of work management. Again, going back in putting it in historical context, by the 1970s, when Royce writes his paper, he already had the experience from the 50s and the 60s of what happened there. And very specifically, the NASA Mercury project in the 1960s was a great example of what at the time was called the iterative and incremental development approach, the IID. The IID was necessary in order to execute the Mercury NASA project because humanity was facing doing work that it had never done before. There was no model. There was no previous example. We tend to talk about best practices. You can't have a best practice when you've never done it before. So if there is no best practice, if there's no blueprint to base your work on, now what do you do? How do you manage that? The iterative approach. That's exactly it. So he had a model that had proven to work, and he was proposing moving in that direction. And it wasn't an isolated example. Around the same time, and it was actually in the 1980s, the IBM had a federal systems division that leveraged IID. So these are concepts that have been with us. They're not brand new. They've been around since the 50s. However, the prevalent system has been the waterfall model, even though when it was defined, it was criticized as being highly risky and not the most effective. Does it work in some situations? Absolutely. As I mentioned before, it's not about saying one is good and one is bad. One's a hammer and one's a screwdriver. We use a hammer for the nails, we use a screwdriver for the screws. And what Royce was highlighting was that the complexity of the work as the development projects were getting larger and larger required, he didn't know about the screwdriver, but required a screwdriver. We needed to move away from the hammer. He just did a great job describing the hammer, and everybody said, "Great, we've got a hammer," and went with it. So what are we left with? In the modern management, there's a lot of influence that comes from this. There's the impact on organizational structure that reinforces this hierarchical setup, um, and each one of those hierarchies having different access to information. The guild system, access to information, same thing. We're mirrored today. Um, we have the influence of project management. Project management is very concerned about tracking, documenting the work of progress, what needs to be done. Well, Gantt charts certainly do that. We've been doing this since the time of the Sumerians. We continue. Is it wrong? No. Is it the only way? No. It's prevalent today. It's affected corporate culture. There's been a path of risk aversion, making sure that the work is in the workplace is highly predictable. That's made it less adaptable by imposing a lot of restrictions. It predefines things, and it does it in great detail. IBM contributed along to this. It created the elements of corporate culture that stay with us today. They started doing it in the 1960s to the 1980s. It's well known for a very conservative, hierarchical culture that imposes strict guidelines from dress code to behavioral norms. It's all very control oriented management. These are elements that we continue to have today in varying degrees in different workplaces, but they're part of modern waterfall. So when we take a look at where we come from, we see that waterfall is not a new phenomenon. And continuing my analogy of nails and screws, nails created, like, I think it was like around 3,000 years before screws emerged in history. In a similar way, waterfall and the origins of waterfall have been with us for 7,000 years. Agile was born in 2001. Yeah, it's at the beginning. For people who have become discouraged by Agile, I would say we're just at the beginning. We need to evolve these things, just like the screw needed to evolve. So there's a lot of resistance, and the resistance is very understandable. We can't change this overnight. The mindset that has led to modern waterfall ways of doing work has been there for thousands of years. That's what we need to change. Human minds are flexible, highly adaptable. Of course, that is a trait that has allowed us to survive through history. And it doesn't change that quickly. It needs time to adapt, and it needs good reasons to adapt. So when we're looking at implementing the agile way of doing things, we need to pay close attention to where we come from and understand that that's what we need to overcome, and do so in a way that doesn't threaten our ability to produce the work. We need to be able to do that. So it's a process. That's why we can't talk about a journey. Agile transformations are a journey. And there's a painful journey because we have to let go of a lot of things that are deeply ingrained in our psyche in favor of new ways of doing things. It's very difficult to do. Some companies can't. It's so ingrained in their DNA that they just can't overcome it. A perfect example that we like to bring up in management circles, in agile management circles, is Nokia. As time goes on, we'll probably have to revisit that because people may not remember what Nokia was. Nokia went from being a leader in telecommunications to a footnote that agile coaches talk about. And it was because their culture did not allow them to pivot. They couldn't transition from the hardware manufacturing model to software development of the smartphones. The smartphones required. And as a result, they lost all their marketplace. Their market share disappeared overnight. That's what happens when we lose that flexibility. And as we look into the future, implementing, integrating AI to the workplace, very real risk is that if the waterfall mindset prevails, AI can supercharge it to levels that are hard to imagine today. We tend to look at AI as a tool to optimize existing processes, and there's nothing wrong with that. And there are areas that will make perfect sense to just hand them over to AI because it's more efficient and it will be better at doing them. That's fine. That's great. So we need to be selective in where we apply this. But if we continue on the waterfall model, we'll have I think that it will have very disruptive effects on the workplace. And a caution that I would give to those who embrace the waterfall model is that your jobs are likely the first ones to be at risk. And that includes management and workers alike. Why? Because that's the type of work that's easier to automate. If, as a manager, all that we're doing is monitoring, tracking, recording, reporting, AI can do that a lot better and a lot easier and 24 by 7. If what we like in our work is simple, well explained, well detailed, specced out work, that's very easy to communicate to an AI to execute it. So for both management and workers who prefer that, I really think that there's a caution here that that kind of work is likely to be the first in line to be replaced by AI. Whereas Agile focuses on complex work that AI, at least today, is not able to tackle. So something to think about and talk about more in future. So as we look into the future, Um, I hope that we can balance these things. I hope that we can figure out the good places to implement AI to help us bring under control the controlling aspects of our work, to hand it off all of the burden and all of the downsides of it, to have AIs that help us implement, that take care of that, not burden us anymore, and relieve us as workers to do the more creative, the more puzzling, the more exciting type of work. I think that would be a very fun place to end up in. And this is a good way in which AI can help us. We don't have to abandon 7,000 years of ways of doing work. We can modernize them with AI and leave them to AI manage so that we can do bigger, better things. So, with that, hope that you've learned a little bit about where Waterfall comes from, that you can understand its historical context and you can see how it really influences the way that we do work today, the way that we think today, the way that we interact with each other at work. Its origins is legendary. Changing that will take us time. The good news is that there are ways, there is a model that we can embrace and we can shape into something that will help us in the future. And I think that AI will help us do that if we apply it correctly. I'd love to hear your thoughts and comments, your ideas, your counterpoints to these things that I've shared today. And I look forward to seeing you in the chat at comments and talk to you in the future about it. Thank you for joining me today, and I'll see you next time.